These hieroglyphs reveal the first thing that happens after death. Before the light there is a room in the Valley of the Kings that was sealed for more than 3,000 years. When Howard Carter's team opened the burial chamber of Thutmose III in 1898, they found the walls covered floor to ceiling in a text that had never been intended for living eyes. Not decoration, not prayer. A technical document. An hour-by-hour record of what happens to the soul after the body stops breathing, beginning not with light, not with a tunnel, not with peace, but with something the priests of Amun were very specific about. Total darkness and a gate with a name. The text on those walls is called the Amduat, which translates from Middle Egyptian as that which is in the underworld. It is the oldest illustrated book in human history, predating the Iliad by 1,000 years and the Book of Revelation by 1,500. And it begins not where you have been told the afterlife begins. It begins in the first hour of the night, in a place the hieroglyphs call the hidden chamber, where the soul of the newly dead arrives not at a throne but at a door. And standing at that door is not an angel, not a comforting presence waiting to lead you forward. The hieroglyphs name what stands there. They give its title. And its title translates as the one who strips what was carried in. This is not the version of death the ancient world handed down to popular memory. The Book of the Dead describes the weighing of the heart, the hall of judgment, the feather of Maat, balanced against whatever you accumulated in life. That text was for everyone, common people, minor officials, anyone who could afford the papyrus. The Amduat was different. For most of dynastic Egypt's recorded history, it was carved exclusively inside the burial chambers of pharaohs, written in a shorthand style the priests called stick figures, sealed behind stone never meant to be moved again. The pharaoh was the only person who needed to know what the first hour contained, because the first hour was the part that had been edited out of everything else. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what the hieroglyphs record in the first hours of death, before judgment, before any light reaches the soul, including the name and function of each gate described in the Amduat's first hour, the full tribunal sequence the priests carve before the weighing ceremony begins, and the complete Amduat passage as it appears in the burial chamber of Thutmose III at the Valley of the Kings, glyph sequence by glyph sequence, I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The Egyptians did not believe death was a transition to light. That concept is not in the original record. What is in the original record is a 12-hour journey, 1 hour for each hour of the night, and the first hour is not warm and it is not lit. The hieroglyphs that open the Amduat describe the soul entering a space the scribes called the Duat. Not a metaphor, not a poetic symbol, a specific named location with specific geography, specific inhabitants, and specific procedures every soul follows in the same order regardless of who they were in life. The first thing the Amduat says happens is this. The soul loses its name. Not symbolically. The text is administrative in its register, clinical in its precision. The soul that enters the first hour of the Duat is referred to throughout that section not by the name the person carried in life, but by a term that translates roughly as the one who has not yet passed. It is a category designation. The soul becomes a member of a class, stripped of individual identity at the moment of entry. The determinative glyph attached to this term, the classifier that ancient Egyptian scribes used to indicate the conceptual category of what was being named, is a seated figure with its hands bound behind its back. That is the first thing the hieroglyphs record. Not arrival in light, arrival in darkness, classification, and restraint. The entrance to the first hour is guarded by a being the Amduat identifies by a specific title that Egyptologists have translated in several ways across the past century. The most commonly cited rendering is the Great Serpent of the Threshold. But the German Egyptologist Erich Hornung, who produced the definitive scholarly edition of the Amduat in 1963, and whose work remains the standard academic reference for the text, noted in his commentary that the title's construction is more specific than a zoological description. The root terms, when examined against J's cognates and comparative Semitic structures, suggest not a serpent in the biological sense, but a mechanism, something that coils and compresses, that takes what passes through it and restructures it before allowing it to continue forward. Hornung did not publish that reading as a formal translation. He placed it in a footnote that most subsequent researchers have not engaged with. What passes through that gate does not come out the same. The Amduat is precise about what is removed at each gate. At the first gate, the record describes the separation of what the Egyptians called the Ba from what they called the Ka. The Ba is the mobile soul, the aspect of the person that carries personality, memory, and individual identity. The Ka is the vital force, the animating energy that made the physical form alive rather than simply present. At the moment of death, the Ba separates from the body naturally. That much is standard Egyptian theology. But what the Amduat records at the first gate of the Duat is not the separation of soul from body. It is the separation of the Ba from the Ka. For the first time since birth, what was always a unified entity becomes two distinct components. The Amduat records what happens to each of them. The Ba continues forward into the second hour, traveling alone through the remaining darkness. The Ka is held at the first gate, in the custody of the being stationed there, until the Ba has completed all 12 hours and returns. This is the detail that does not appear in any popular account of ancient Egyptian belief. The soul does not move as a unified entity through the underworld. It is divided at the first gate, and the half that holds the vital force is detained there while the other half continues the journey alone through 11 more hours of diminishment. The very first thing that happens after death, according to the oldest illustrated book in human history, is not light, not welcome, not rest. It is separation. The soul is taken apart at the entrance, and one part of what you were is held at the door, while the rest of you goes forward into a darkness where each successive hour removes another layer of what you thought you were. What makes this stranger is that the same structure appears in 3 other ancient traditions with no known transmission pathway, connecting any of them to Egypt. A gate at the entrance, a division of the soul at that gate, the detention of one component while another proceeds, and a stripping process that continues through each successive threshold until what remains is something smaller than a name. The first parallel is the Book of Enoch, chapter 22. Enoch is not a minor text. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at Qumran in 1947, 11 complete manuscripts of Enoch were found among them, more copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more than Exodus. It was not fringe literature. It was read widely, copied carefully, and treated as authoritative by the same communities that preserved the Hebrew Scriptures. The Church of Rome removed it from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never did. The oldest complete manuscripts exist today in Ge'ez, held in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, where they have not left the building in 4 centuries. Chapter 22 of Enoch describes the angel Raphael showing Enoch a place where the dead are held. It describes 4 chambers with different conditions for different categories of souls. 3 hold the dead in varying states depending on the nature of their lives. But the 4th chamber is described differently. Enoch 22-9 records that the souls there are separated from their companions. The Gaze uses the word for partition, for division. They are not simply in a different place. They are in a divided state. Raphael's explanation in verse 10 is the detail that connects most precisely to what the Amduat records at the first gate. He tells Enoch that these souls have been separated from the part of them that belong to the world. Not separated from their memories, not from their sins, from the part of them that belong to the world. That phrase, in the context of Enoch's cosmological framework, refers to the life force component, the animating element that connected the soul to physical existence. What the Egyptians would have identified as the Ka. What Enoch describes at the entrance to the holding chamber is functionally identical to what the Amduat describes at the first gate of the Duat. Souls in a divided state, the animating component detained, the identity component existing separately until something outside the text's immediate frame changes, 2 different languages, 2 different centuries, 2 different civilizations with no documented contact at the level of theological specificity required to explain this parallel. The same sequence at the threshold of the dead. Before we move on to what the Babylonian record adds to this sequence, stop for a second. What you just heard about the stripping process that takes place at the first gate is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full Ge'ez manuscript passage from Enoch chapter 22. The name of the first warden, the stripping of the soul. It is all in the document link below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The Babylonian tradition adds a dimension to this that neither Egypt nor Enoch states with comparable structural clarity, and it arrives in the most detailed account of underworld entry that survives from ancient Mesopotamia. The text is the descent of Inanna in its Sumerian version and the descent of Ishtar in its Akkadian rendering, existing in copies that date to at least 2100 BCE, with mythological content scholars believe is considerably older. It describes the goddess of heaven and earth descending into the underworld, the place the Sumerians called the Kur, the great below. The queen of heaven choosing to go down into the realm of the dead, to the place from which no one returns. And the architecture of that descent is specific enough to constitute a procedure rather than a story. There are 7 gates. At each gate, a gatekeeper removes something from Inanna. At the first gate, the gatekeeper removes her crown. At the second, her earrings. At the third, her necklace. At the fourth, the ornaments on her chest. At the fifth, her girdle. At the sixth, the bracelets from her hands and feet. At the seventh and final gate, the last garment covering her body. She arrives in the presence of Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, completely stripped, carrying nothing. The Sumerian text was for centuries read as mythology, as a goddess narrative about seasonal cycles. But the stripping sequence is not seasonal symbolism. The items removed at each gate correspond with precision to the layers of power, status, and identity a person accumulates during life. Crown, office and title. Earrings, household membership. Necklace, lineage and social position. Chest ornaments, accumulated material standing. Girdle, physical vitality. Bracelets, the capacity for action. The final garment, the last layer of distinction that makes one body distinct from another. What arrives before Ereshkigal is not Inanna, the queen of heaven. What arrives is an entity stripped of title, lineage, vitality, and the capacity for action, reduced to whatever remains when everything accumulated during life has been surrendered gate by gate before the center is reached. Compare that structure to the Amduat's progression. The Ba enters the Duat at the first hour. At the first gate, the separation from the Ka removes the animating force. In the hours that follow, each threshold strips another element. The texts name what is removed at each passage. Identity markers associated with social role are released at the second hour. What the Egyptians called the Ib, the heart consciousness that carries the moral record of a life, is not destroyed but enters a kind of suspended state in the fourth hour. By the time the Ba reaches the sixth hour, the midpoint of the 12-hour journey, it has been reduced to what the Amduat scribes record, using a term that the German scholar Jan Assmann, who has spent 4 decades analyzing the text, translates as the essential form. In the hieroglyphs, the essential form at the sixth hour is depicted as a cartouche with nothing inside it. The cartouche is the most significant symbol in the Egyptian writing system, the oval boundary placed around the name of a pharaoh on every monument of consequence. The cartouche says, this identity is protected, this designation has a frame marking it as preserved. When the Amduat depicts the traveling soul at the sixth hour as a cartouche with nothing written inside it, that is not an image of destruction. It is an image of the container without its content. The boundary remains. What the frame was protecting has been given up at successive gates, but the frame itself has not been eliminated. What happens at the 7th through 12th hours is the approach towards something the Amduat does not call recovery. The soul approaches what the scribes call the moment before dawn, and what they mean by dawn is not the sunrise living people observe from the surface. They mean the event that occurs at the 12th hour, deep within the Duat, when the sun god Ra, traveling the same 12 hours in a boat, is described in the hieroglyphs in terms no translation has fully captured in English. He is born from the body of the night. Not returned, not restored, born. The word the scribes used is the same word used for the birth of a child from a mother. The 12th hour of the Amduat is a birth sequence, not a restoration sequence. And the pharaoh's name is embedded in the text alongside Ra's, traveling in the same boat, present at the same 12th hour. The text addresses him directly, placing his cartouche beside Ra's. Whatever is born from the body of the night at the 12th hour includes the soul that entered through the first gate and was divided there. The biblical record adds something that neither Egypt nor Babylon states with this precision, and it comes not from passages about heaven but from the passages about Sheol, the Hebrew term for the place of the dead, which appears in the Old Testament more than 60 times, and is almost never translated accurately in popular editions. Sheol is not a synonym for hell. The Hebrew Bible equates Sheol with darkness, with stillness, with arrested existence. Psalm 88-12 describes it as the land of forgetting. The Hebrew phrase is Eretz Neshia, the land where things are forgotten, not the land where you forget. The land where you are forgotten, where the things that constituted your identity are no longer maintained in active relationship by the structure of existence around you. The forgetting belongs to the world you left. Job chapter 10 describes Sheol as the land of darkness and deep shadow, a land where the light is as darkness. The Hebrew uses the word as, the conjunction of comparison. It is not that there is no light in Sheol. It is that what light exists functions as darkness, light that does not illuminate, light that, in the Amduat's terms, has not yet been born for the soul still moving through the hours before the 12th. Isaiah 14-9 adds the structural detail that connects most precisely to the Amduat's account of the detained Ka. The text describes Sheol stirring up the dead, rousing them from below. The Hebrew verb translated as stirring up is oyer, and it is not the word for waking from sleep. It is the word for bringing motion to something held in arrested suspension. The dead in Sheol are not simply resting. They are held in a condition requiring an external trigger to reverse it. What triggers it is not specified in Isaiah. The Amduat describes it. The return of the Ba after the 12th hour, reuniting with the Ka detained at the first gate. The dormant becomes capable of activation only when the separated halves are rejoined. This is what the four traditions converge on, and the convergence is precise enough to be worth stating carefully. Egypt records division at the first gate, the vital component detained, the identity traveling alone through 12 stations of progressive reduction, the boundary preserved intact at the 6th hour while its content is held elsewhere, something born at the 12th hour that did not exist before the journey began. Enoch records souls in a divided state, separated from the part of them that belonged to the world, held in that division until a condition outside the text's frame changes it. Babylon records systematic stripping at 7 gates, one layer at a time, from title down to the final garment, until the soul carries nothing into the center. The Bible records Sheol as the land where identity is forgotten, where the dead exist in arrested suspension, where the vital component waits for what Isaiah calls a stirring up that comes from outside the waiting itself. 4 civilizations, 4 languages. One sequence at the entrance to the dead, darkness first, division at the threshold. Stripping through successive gates. The soul reduced to its essential container, and a reunion at the far end of the night the Egyptians described as birth. The priests who wrote the Amduat on those burial chamber walls were not composing mythology. The text does not read like myth. It reads like a procedure document, a manual for what to expect at each hour and what will be required at each gate. Specific beings stationed at specific thresholds, specific elements removed in a specific sequence, specific conditions that must be met before the next passage opens. The scribes who carved this in the shorthand they called stick figures were working from a tradition they considered precise and consequential. Precise in the sense that the details could be verified. Consequential in the sense that the person whose name was carved alongside Ra's would need those details to be accurate. The pharaoh entombed in that chamber, surrounded by those inscriptions on all 4 walls, was supposed to follow the procedure on the walls. The text was not aspirational literature about a hoped-for afterlife. It was operational instruction for a journey considered real enough to map in detail. And the first instruction, at the entrance to the first hour, the first thing the text prepares the reader to encounter, is also the instruction that every other ancient tradition converges on from its own independent direction. Give up what you carried in. The gate will not open for what you accumulated. The being stationed there, the one whose title translates as the one who strips what was carried in, will take it whether you release it or not. Name, status, vital force, the layers of a life built across decades, they stay at the threshold. What passes through the gate and into the first hour is the container, and the container in the hieroglyphs is not nothing. The cartouche shape, the oval boundary that the Egyptians placed around every pharaoh's name on every monument of significance, is the most structurally loaded symbol in their writing system. It does not mean a person, it means a name that is protected by a boundary. When the Amduat shows the soul at the 6th hour as a cartouche with nothing written inside it, that image is not an image of loss. It is an image of readiness. The boundary is intact. The protection is still in place. The frame that once held a name is empty now, not because the name was destroyed, but because what the boundary will hold at the 12th hour has not yet been born. What fills the cartouche again at the 12th hour? The texts approach from different angles, but arrive at the same answer. Egypt says it is new. The word used for what is born at the 12th hour is not the word for recovery or return. It is the word for first occurrence. Something that did not exist before the 12-hour journey began is what emerges from the body of the night. Enoch's divided souls, once reunited, are described in chapter 25 as entering a state the Ge'ez renders, in terms scholars have struggled to place in existing categories: not restored, not recovered, something requiring a category that did not previously exist. The Babylonian Inanna ascends through the same 7 gates where her items are returned one by one, but she exits by a different path than the one she descended by. Something that was not with her on the way down accompanies her on the way up. The darkness at the beginning of the Amduat's first hour is described by the scribes with a word that appears in only 2 other contexts in Egyptian literature. It appears in texts describing the condition of the world before the first sunrise in creation. And it appears in texts describing the interior of the sealed granite sarcophagus before the lid is placed. The same word for the darkness of creation before light, for the darkness of the sealed tomb, and for the darkness of the first hour of the Duat. Egypt gives the sequence a procedural structure. Enoch gives it a geography. Babylon gives it 7 gates. The The Bible gives it a name. All four point to the same hour, the hour that comes first, the hour that precedes everything assumed about the beginning of whatever follows death. Before the light, there is a gate. Before the gate opens, what you carried is taken. Before what you carried is taken, something is stationed there specifically for that purpose, a being whose function is so precisely defined that the Egyptians gave it a title instead of a name. The title is the job. The gate does not open for the job to be skipped. The stripping happens. The detention happens. The reduction to the cartouche, with nothing inside it, happens. And then the 12 hours continue. And at the far end of the 12th hour, in the deepest part of what the Egyptians called the hidden land, the body of the night opens and something is born from it that could not have existed if the first hour had not proceeded exactly the way the Amduat records. The priests of Amun knew this. The scribes who wrote the Gaze manuscripts knew it. The clay tablet makers of Sumer knew it. And they recorded it not because they found it comforting, not because it was the story people wanted to hear. They recorded it because they believed someone was going to need to know. The burial chamber of Thutmose III still stands in the Valley of the Kings. The stick figures of the Amduat proceed across the sandstone walls in the shorthand register that was never meant for anyone but the pharaoh, whose name is written alongside Ra's in the boat that travels all 12 hours. The first gate is still described there. The being stationed at that gate still carries its title. The instruction at the entrance to the first hour is still the same. And it begins as everything in the oldest illustrated book in human history begins, in the dark.